So our second snippet for this week looks at the Cold War and civil liberties. And one thing that's worth keeping in mind here is that, well, it's true, this era was an era of massive deprivations in civil liberties. It's also true that there were actually communist spies, and among the more famous was this Brooklyn congressman named Samuel Dickstein. There is a Dickstein Plaza that still exists in New York City. It's very difficult to once an entity gets named, it's very difficult to unname it. So it's still there. At least it was there a few years ago. The last time I looked, and this was a congressman who took money from the NKVD, which is the forerunner to the KGB, the Soviet spy agency. And his code name, this was a piece published around 6 or 7 years ago, was Crook, because even for the Soviets, Dickstein was seen as a crook. And what Dickstein did was to use his authority as a member of Congress to pass these things called private member bills. And so these were common in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where there'd be an immigration quota, and you'd want to get the person. There'd be an associate or a friend of a friend or a relative or something that the member of Congress would want to get into the United States, and so Congress would pass hundreds of these bills every session that would say person X can come in. And what Dickstein did was to pass private member bills that allowed Soviet spies to come in as U.S. citizens, and then took money from the Soviets on the side. So again, this is an era where the Soviets are actively engaged in espionage against the United States, but also there's this extremely broad definition of what constitutes anti-communism in this era, and a sense that civil liberties have to take a back seat. And the key entity that was pushing this, at least initially, was this organization called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, which first came to prominence in the mid 40s under a Texas congressman named Martin Dies, D-I-E-S, who was chair of the committee for several years, and then the Republicans took over and they pushed it as well. And the Dies committee, looked to crack down on. HUAC was initially founded to deal with the threat posed by the German Bund, this German ethnic organization that had a lot of it had Nazi ties in the late 30s. But HUAC's emphasis very quickly shifted from exposing Nazis in the United States to exposing communists in the United States, and Dies defined communism very, very broadly to have a wide sweep of left-wing figures as well. When the Republicans took control of Congress in 1946, more than 200 of the Republicans requested membership on HUAC because they sensed that this was a committee that, if you were an ambitious politician, you could go places with this committee. This is a very young Richard Nixon, having been elected to the House from California in 1946, assigned to HUAC. Nixon was much smarter than many of his contemporaries and was able to use his perch on HUAC to expose a communist spy in the State Department named Alger Hiss. And unlike many of his colleagues, Nixon actually did target a real spy, although Hiss denied it until his dying day. There were documents called the Venona documents that came out in the 1990s that basically confirmed that Hiss appeared to be a spy. This is a photograph of Hiss testifying before HUAC, denying that he was a Soviet spy. He was ultimately convicted as a result of this testimony for perjury and sentenced to prison for 5 years. This gives a sense of this was a press release from HUAC. HUAC's highest profile effort was not the targeting of Hiss or the focus on the State Department. Instead, it was this wide-ranging investigation of Hollywood in 1947 and 1948, to under the premise that the goal of that there were leftists in Hollywood that were trying to shape the mindset of moviegoers. And this culminated in this very famous hearing where actors, directors were brought before the committee this is the very dawn of television, and asked whether they had ever been a communist. Some people in Hollywood backed this effort. This was Ronald Reagan's first emergence as a key political leader. Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild, the Actors Union. So here's a sort of taste of what that committee proceeding was like.
Have you ever observed any communistic information in any scripts?
Well, I have turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. They haven't attempted to use me, I don't think, because apparently they know that I'm not very sympathetic to communism.
There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild board and officers or the Guild itself, as evidenced by the vote on various issues. That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer
denied.
to a question
Then you
which invades his. Absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
denied. You refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will
All right.
offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away
I have
from the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand
continue
away from the
to
stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are
Officer,
trying to
take
destroy.
this man away from the stand.
So again, this was not the model of how a congressional committee should operate. So this is HUAC, but there's also this sort of assault on civil liberties that comes from the Senate, which we often think of as McCarthyism. Although to me, the more effective legislator in this regard was this guy, Pat McCarran. Was a very, very conservative Democrat from Nevada. If any of you pre-virus had ever been to Las Vegas, you flew into the Pat McCarran Las Vegas International Airport. They're in the process of changing the name of the airport just to strip him off. So if you go there now, it's going to be the Harry Reid airport. McCarran was an ultra-conservative Catholic. He believed that he was sort of in the Senate, on a mission from God to root out communism, and he was the chief sponsor of two major pieces of legislation: the Internal Security Act and the McCarran-Walter Immigration Act. Internal Security Act, tightened loyalty requirements for a whole variety of public employees, and the McCarran-Walter Act imposed restrictions on immigration for members of not just the Communist Party but Communist Front organizations. And so McCarran is sort of shaping the law during this period in a way to restrict the civil liberties of potential immigrants and of federal workers. This is a Congress which passes a bill called the Smith Act, which outlaws the Communist Party in its entirety on grounds that it is a subversive organization. This law was challenged in a quite famous case called Dennis versus the United States, where the Supreme Court upholds the law. And the key phrase or the key reasoning here that I have here in red is basically, we're going to assume, the Supreme Court says, that all communists are committed to the overthrow of the government, and therefore there's no obligation on the part of the government to simply wait until a coup has actually occurred. And this generates a quite passionate dissent from Hugo Black, someone with a sort of strong First Amendment approach for much of his time on the court. And what Black suggests in the dissent, I think, is correct, which is that the majority kind of bowed to the passions of the mob, and that in retrospect, this would be recognized as a flawed decision. So this era culminates in the activity of Joe McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator. Unlike McCarran, and whatever you say about McCarran, I think was really a true believer in this cause. McCarthy was a demagogue. He was interested in political power. He sensed that the anti-communist issue would be one that he could maximize his position with, and he benefited politically from this. He waged a 4-year campaign from 1950 through 1954, exposing alleged communists in the federal government. Virtually none of these people were actually communist. There was an attempt early in the McCarthy period to to sort of beat him back. That was organized by this woman, maybe the most famous of the 20th century senators from my home state, Margaret Chase Smith, who issued in 1950 what she called a Declaration of Conscience, in which she argued that Republicans in the Senate should stand up to McCarthy, but very few of her colleagues agreed with her. And it wasn't until 1954 that when McCarthy took on the army, that his position ultimately collapsed. So the main pattern here with national security issues is that by and large, in the early stages of the Cold War, late 40s, early 50s, both Congress and the Supreme Court adopted the position that basically civil liberties had to take a back seat to implementing an anti-communist vision.